Chapter 9. The Trapping Season. Before a fresh snow could obliterate the wolf tracks, Jim had found places to set 24 of the deadly wire snares, as well as his 6 steel traps. The pack was ranging over many miles of river country. It had, however, a very deliberate route. Certain game trails were as permanent as the main streets through a town. They remained in use both summer and winter, and led from one good grazing and browsing section to another, knitting together the whole of the mountain country and giving contact with the foothill and ranch territory to the east and south. The restlessness of the various members of the deer family showed itself in almost constant wandering backwards and forwards over these trails, except when snow was deep or the fawns too young. Brown Chest often used the game paths, but he also followed the ice on the rivers or trotted along the river banks. His experience with traps and snares had made him wary of narrow places. Jim, in following his tracks, found a number of spots where the old leader left the ice to examine some promising thicket on the right or left bank. At each of these, he set a snare or two made of double strands of the toughest wire he could buy. It might be a matter of weeks before the pack again visited those exact places, but sooner or later they would come. Meanwhile, the snares, not being in regular trails, were not likely to be sprung by other animals. The steel traps he set at spots along the game trails where the wolves stopped to leave scent. Sometimes the end of a log or a lone boulder or a tree trunk where paths intersected served as such range markers. No full-grown wolf would pass one of these scent-marked places without stopping to examine it in order to ascertain what other wolves had passed that way. Instinct and jealousy prompted him to leave his own scent before departing. Thus, there was a record of recent wolf visits for all to read. Coyotes and dogs, belonging as they did to the wolf family, also noted and used the same range markers. When Jim set traps, he hid them from sight and dusted snow over everything that showed signs of his work. Then he used the stuffed foot of a wolf to make tracks over the fatal pan. Branches that he dropped in the path or on each side of the trap helped to make a wolf step on the right spot. His 6th and last set was at the base of a cliff where porcupines for generations had lived under one of the ledges. Evidently, the place had an interesting smell, for Brown Chest and his pack had stopped there to wander about and investigate. Here, too, were many wolverine and coyote tracks. Such a place had special possibilities. Jim noted where the wolves had circled a scent stump near the main trail. Here he buried his last trap and fastened the chain with wire wrapped around the trunk of a stout sapling. Late that night, back in his cabin of logs, he heard a wolf howling up the valley. It was the lonesome call, long, drawn-out, and eerie. Jim tried to shut it out of his ears by pulling the heavy sleeping bag closer to his head, but the howl persisted, and at each interval seemed nearer. Evidently, the wolf was coming down the porcupine on the ice. Finally, it stopped. Next morning, the track of a single wolf was plain in the main trail, and in one of the snares, Jim found it caught by the neck and dead. From its actions the night before, it was evidently a newcomer. It was a rangy gray youngster with the general look of old gray, but not his size. Jim could always see family resemblance in the wolves. He reset the snare, dragged the heavy animal a short distance into the forest, and skinned him there. The fine hide he took back to the cabin and stretched out for drying. The catch heightened his hopes. He felt the elation of his success, but he was not to hear or see more of the wolves for many days. Brown Chest had left the porcupine. Now he was ranging the Athabasca Valley, running the deer relentlessly further and further toward the foothills. He did not turn back toward the old territory until the middle of January. Other wolves were then coming into the Athabasca, spoiling the hunting. Also, a trapper had set snares in the best stretch of timber. So one night, the pack turned west and traveled miles into the mountains. Toward morning, a doe had led them part way back in a wild chase which ended when they pulled her down in a snow-choked glade. Here they stuffed themselves and stopped for the day, separating to find snug bedding places in the warmest spruce thickets. Next evening they were again traveling, single file along the main game trail. Suddenly Brown Chest stopped. The others did the same immediately. They stood silently watching and sniffing toward the woods ahead. Then, out from the trees trotted 3 strange wolves. In the lead came a big gray. The 3 checked their gait, but after a moment advanced stiffly. Brown Chest stood on his toes and raised his head as high as he could, yet the gray overtopped him. The old brown leader knew only too well that his worn teeth and stiffening muscles were no match for the younger wolves and that he must avoid a fight, but his bluff was perfect. The young gray was impressed and almost cowed by the solid assurance of the other. He moved on to face the remainder of the pack. Thus it happened that he came face to face with Blackie's pup. Except in color, the two looked almost exactly alike. The gray was the lone survivor of Blackie's litter of the year before. Now he and the 2 youngsters with him were all that remained from a large band. The trappers had taken their toll. The brothers stood looking at each other. Along their spines the hair bristled. Each knew that the other was a powerful fighting machine, to be avoided if possible, yet neither flinched. Gradually the other wolves formed a circle. The black one at length broke the spell. His tail began to wag. He was not a grouch. He whined good-naturedly. Instantly the tension relaxed. There would be no fight after all. The well-fed youngsters of both bands prepared to romp, but Brown Chest moved on. Reluctantly, his pack turned away from new friends and trotted after him. They came to the Porcupine. Old Jim's cabin was near the main trail. The wolves sniffed the tainted air, caught the man scent, and with cautious steps sneaked by. But more powerful than man scent was that of dog. Jim's husky had followed him from the town on his last trip, and now was sleeping in a snowbank beside the cabin. The black pup recognized his enemy of den days. He would never forget hiding in the rear of the burrow, fighting for his life against the great bully. His hatred flamed up, and he growled deep down in his throat. Brown Chest looked back at the sound. He took a great deal of notice of Blackie's pup these days. All the wolves were now alive to the fact that something was to be done about the dog. In the dim light of the stars, they circled the cabin. Nothing stirred to alarm them. Blackie whined. A sharp-nosed head appeared out of the white snow. Again that enticing, inquiring whine. The husky sprang up and tried to look into the blackness of the forest. He caught the smell of wolves very close. Without a moment's thought, he dashed in the direction of the whine, barking furiously. In his inexperience, he plunged headlong right into the waiting line. Between him and the cabin rose up a great black wolf. Blackie's pup suddenly found that the dog was not the immense creature he had remembered. He closed with the husky. There was a wild roar of excitement as others joined the fray. The dog rolled over, shrieking, clawing against the merciless black avengers. An explosion rent the air. The wolves stood for a moment petrified, then dashed away. Jim, in the doorway, reloaded the rifle. He had been awakened by the noise and had fired at random to save the dog. The husky slunk in and hid behind the grub box. He was badly cut in several places. One gash, given by the sharp young teeth of the black pup, ran from his right eye to his ear. His left hind leg was ripped along the tendon. Around his heavy shoulders, the hair was dyed red. Jim heaped up a big log fire and in the wavering light worked over him for a long time. The pack continued up the Porcupine. Jim was forgotten. They were rejoicing in the return to familiar haunts. They stopped to look at each place where there had once been a kill and feast. They dug up old bones, sniffed along the old moose trails, pattered over the ice. Suddenly, there was a fearful howl. One of the gray pups was in a snare. She was dashing about, choking herself. As long as she leaped and howled, the other wolves slunk about in a panic. The fun was over for the pack. They trooped dispiritedly into the forest. Almost mechanically, one of the other youngsters stopped at a scent post where Brown Chest had already passed. There was a click of steel, a yowl of fright and pain. The pup reared up and was thrown head over heels by the jerk on his front foot when the chain drew taut. Then the remainder of the pack ran, blindly into the shadows. By next evening, Jim had tacked 2 fresh skins on his cabin wall opposite the first one. He sat there smoking and looking at them. Yes, he had had great luck, but his trump card had not yet been played. In a bottle, on the shelf, he had kept some scent from the stray wolf, the stranger he had snared. Now that the mating season was at hand, he would use this as a lure to bring the jealous males of the pack into his trap sets. So far, he had done little except keep the traps free from too much snow. They had never been baited. Now he would try the new plan. He thought he heard a wolf howl. Opening the door, he looked out. The night was clear and windy. His thermometer, nailed to the logs, registered 30 degrees below zero. The husky climbed out of his burrow in the snow pile and slipped into the cabin to crouch beside the fire. Above the pass, the northern lights flickered. Somewhere in the valley below, a coyote began to yap. The old man shivered and braced the crude door against the wind.